talking about circumstantial landmines. I've retooled a couple of other stories I did, but some of you probably haven't seen these anyway. But some of the stuff that you stumble across stays with you in your mind and in your memory, and I just kind of like to share this because everybody that's worked on cars for a living has stumbled across a situation where it made them look bad, but it wasn't their fault, and that's what this presentation's about. In 1983, I was working at a Volkswagen dealer, and we used to do valve adjustments all the time. They were had those little shims underneath the on top of the cam follower here, and that shim had to be changed out using these special tools, and it was like $20. It was, I think 18 or 20 bucks is all that we charged in those days to do that. But you got to remember that was 1983, and but you could knock it out pretty quick. They were a lot like the ones that are on overhead cam engines in Toyotas. Don't have shims on top of them, but you are supposed to measure with the mic the distance between here and the top, and they are different. There are different values, and so on and so forth. But we're not really talking about the Toyota today, but these Volkswagens, and like the picture I'm showing you right here, you see the little notch right there on that Volkswagen. You basically would take that, use that little tool to push the cam follower down. Then you'd use those special pliers, and I'll show you a picture of those again in a minute, to pull that shim out of there, just like you see on this cross section that I drew using Microsoft Paint. And pretty much you're looking at the cam follower riding right on top of the lobe riding right on top of the cam follower. But nowadays there's these roller rocker arms and stuff that follow the cam and that kind of thing, and that's really, I think, probably a better system, but there are still some engines out there that use this method here. Question 1, the test is going to be ongoing on this one. What's the term that describes the A indicated on the valve opening chart? Well, we're not going to make this too much of a mystery. Anybody that knows much about engines knows that that's overlap. That and the fact that it says overlap right there, that's when both valves are open at the same time to purge the rest of the exhaust gases from the burn, and without that, the engine wouldn't run nearly as good or as smooth. But it was routine for a Volkswagen dealer tech to do this, and so what we would do is use these pliers right here to take that little shim off of the top of the cam follower. These were the tools you would use to roll it around the cam shaft and push those cam followers down. It was the first time you did it, it seemed ridiculous, but you would measure the clearance with the lobe up, and there was a go no go feeler gauge, and there was a spec for the exhaust and a spec for the intake. And the go no go feeler gauge I had was on one end for the exhaust, the other end for the intake. I don't remember the specs, but they were somewhere in the general neighborhood of 0.010 of an inch or something like that. And the whole job can be done really quick by somebody that does it all the time. Well, I drew a ticket on a Diesel Rabbit. That was a routine job, and it turned nasty. I had done hundreds of valve adjustments on those. It was just so routine that we did them. And you pull the breather off, pop this little valve cover off here, do those valve adjustments. You got to turn the engine through, and the clearance was measured right here, where I'm indicating with this little arrow. But this one here, because the valves were so loose outside of specs, I had to use shims from the shim kit that were really thick. And what they did was, the original shim, they had worked that cam follower up and down enough to where there was a layer of varnish right there where it continually stopped on all the valves, or just about all of them. But whenever I did the valve adjustment and I put thicker shims here, it caused that thing to go farther down than it used to go, and the cam follower would get stuck in the varnish, and then the piston would come up and bump the valve, and it would knock it back up. And it wasn't really hurting anything, but man, it was a scary noise when you were spinning it over. When you started it only did it when the engine was cold, and if you'd have kept driving it or run it for a while, it would have probably cleared that up. But when the customer came to pick it up and he heard all that, he was about like the guy in 300 here. He was really angry about that. And so, okay, so at this point, whenever he got through carrying on about his stuff, I could tear everything down and clean the oil varnish for free. See, I didn't cause this problem, but it was on me because I'm the one that did the work. And see, the thing about it is, when I started it up and pulled it out of the shop, it was warm enough so that it didn't do any of this, and I had no reason to suspect. You know, you never needed to do a test drive after adjusting a valve on one of these things. You just need to make sure it didn't leak any oil and all that. Option 2, I could put the valves loose like they were when he came and send him on his way. So that's what I decided to do, because that was the only thing that was going to satisfy this guy without costing me a whole bunch of work. See, I could have pulled the camshafts out, and I could have pulled all the cam followers out, and I could have cleaned all that varnish out of there, and then I could have put them back in, and I could have adjusted the valve right and all that kind of stuff, but I just was not going to do that. That's a circumstantial landmine, because I was working along doing everything by the rules, and it blew up in my face. That's what a circumstantial landmine is. And it happens, but don't get mad, just deal with it and move on. Now, the service advisor brought me one time, and this is what question 2 is about. He brought me this guy out there, and what he had was an F-150 that had one of those fuel switching things, fuel tank switching things on a frame, when a lot of trucks had 2 fuel tanks. And what it would do, it would that diaphragm would rupture in that little filter head thing on the frame that was supposed to, you know, change the tank from one tank to the other, and it would begin to pump fuel from one tank into the other. Well, really, that thing on the frame is the only thing that could be wrong with it, to tell you the truth. And so the service writer walked this guy out there, and I'd never seen the guy, I had never worked on his truck, I didn't know anything about him. And he was standing on the passenger side of the truck looking in through the window while they were talking to me. And so he says, "This guy's truck is transferring gas from one tank to the other. What do you think's wrong with it?" And I said, "Well, if I was going to guess at it, I would say it was that thing on the frame down there. For some reason, that hit the owner of the truck wrong. And he called me an SOB and said, 'You're not experimenting or part swapping on my truck,' blah, blah, blah." Well, what I told the service writer was, I didn't get mad. I just says, "Take this guy back to the write-up area. I'm not going to talk to him anymore," you know, because the guy was being such a jerk. And the guy wanted to come back and talk to me later, but the service writer wouldn't bring him back there. And so that was just one of those things that you run into. This guy was really hard to get along with anyway, and everybody knew it, but I didn't know it until after I ran into him that day. I don't remember ever working on any of his stuff either. I think they pretty well put him out the door and sent him down the road. But you know, when my dad was running his shop in the 1960s, he made a remark to somebody that wanted him to work on a Corvair that he had to do it with the doors closed, because if somebody sees you working on a Corvair, they'll bring you another one. That was kind of funny. But one of the first cars I drove was a 63 Corvair Spider, and I loved that thing until the crankshaft broke. That's one of the things that Corvairs did. They like to break the crankshaft, you know. But now some cars we just don't like. A lot of guys will see these old Ford Probes, you know, this is an 89 model, one of the very first ones that came out. And it was basically a Mazda is what it was. But they're good when they're running, but when they come in with a problem, it can be expensive and painful. And I remember talking one time about one of these I worked on that was quitting when it got hot. And I could not get it to quit sitting in my service bay running. But as soon as I got in and it got out on the bypass, right in front of the video store down there, the doggone thing quit running, just like you shut it off with a key. And I got out and checked, it didn't have any spark. Of course, that's tricky to do by yourself on one of these. But what I did was, I thought, well, that module in the distributor must be heating up, because that's where the module was on that one. And so I took the windshield washer hose and pulled it off and laid it over so it would wash over that sideways mounted distributor, and I whee like that, and that windshield washer stuff cooled that thing off so that it started up. And I got it back to the shop and put a module on it. Never needed to work on the car again after that for that problem. Well, a lot of people don't know it, but the Probe almost replaced the Mustang in 1989, and here's the ad. Isn't that something? I was in the trenches at the Ford dealer when we were hearing about this, and everybody was throwing a screaming fit about it, and Ford got enough angry mail from, you know, Mustang lovers that they reversed course on that, and they just started calling this car the Probe, and they didn't do this, you know, getting rid of the Mustang and replacing it with a probe, which would have been the dumbest thing anybody could have ever done. The Mustang's the most recognized car in the world. Well, question number 3. You come up for a repair order that's very tough. It's a job you don't want to do, not because it doesn't pay well, but because it's a really tough job. What should you do? Complain to the service manager, go home for the day, man up and do the job, beat book time, or tell the customer the car's a piece of junk? Now, the one in question, there was one of these, in 1972, Volkswagen started putting these Porsche engines in their vans. And whenever they had the plain old engine in it like the Bug had in it, it was really easy to pull the motor out of one of these. But when they put that Porsche engine in there, it was a first-class absolute bear to pull that motor out of that thing. And the guy that had been there longer than me, and one of the other mechanics, and he was pretty fast. He could jerk the transmission out of a rabbit in about 20 minutes. But whenever he was handed this work order, he went to the service manager and he raised Cain with him. He says, "You said you weren't going to give me another one of these." And he said, "Well, you're up for the job." And so that guy got his car and went home. And so the service manager gave the job to me, and so I had to pull the motor out of that darn thing, put a crank seal in it. And, the crankshaft seal on those things would leak oil, and you had to pull that thing out. But that was very annoying because that guy knew the service manager would give it to somebody else. And so, if I'd have been the service manager, when he came back, that job would have been sitting there waiting for him, but it wasn't. So I went ahead and did the job and didn't complain. That's what you do. Simultaneous failures. All right, now Joe brought his probe to us with an inoperative air conditioner and a dead charging system. This thing had 2 belts on it. Only one of these belts is published. Published pictured here. You notice the belt from this outside pulley pulls the AC and the alternator, but the other belt pulls the power steering, right? And so here we were, and basically the water pump, and so here we were. Now he drives that thing in, and I said, okay, so he hands me this part of this pulley that he found laying in the driveway. This is the actual photo of balancer off that car where that pulley came off of there. And that inside pulley was still pulling the water pump and the power steering. So anyway, we looked at that and I said, well, that thing's going to have a balancer put on it. So let's just go ahead and get you a balancer coming. And so he left the car with us. This is one of those 89 probes that had 2.5 in it. All right, number 4. When faced with several simultaneous component failures on a vehicle, you should A, replace all the components and close the ticket. B, try to find out what killed the components. C, talk to a service advisor or customer and attempt to determine if all the failures happened at once. Or B and C. I like to ask them, did this start happening all at one time, or was it something that came on gradually? Does it happen hot, cold, whatever? You get all the information you can so you can sort all that out with your data and make a good decision. Well, installing a new balancer would be simple because it was a little bit aggravating to get that balancer off of there because it was so close to the side of the car. And a replacement balancer was $130. So we inspected, when I pulled it off, we looked at the part of the timing belt I could see that was visible with the balancer pulled off, and that timing belt was brand new. Somebody had just put a timing belt on it. We slid the new pulley onto the end of the crank, put the necessary torque to overcome the interference fit. We seated the gear and pinched it against the crank. I'm talking about the crank gear that was pulling the timing belt. Put it against the crankshaft ball. All right, the reason that's important, well, let's look at number 5 first. If the outer part of a harmonic balancer slips, the timing marks may not be dependable, the crank sensor might be damaged, the belt might wear unevenly, any of the above. Also, you may have a little bit of a vibration there. So that's just a fairly easy question right there. But putting this thing on and torquing it right, some of these balancers, like on Toyota Camrys, on some of your Ford Escorts, when you took that bolt out, you could just grab that balancer and pull it off, or that bottom pulley, and pull it off over your fingers. That's not usually the case. Ordinarily it takes a puller, and it did in this case. And the interference fit has got to be overcome, and you've got to torque that thing hard enough to where it's really pinching this crank gear, which is right here, pictured right here in this case. This crank gear has got to be pinched against this boss really hard so that the keyway locates it, but the key is not intended to carry a load. See, so you take this balancer and you put it on there really, really good and tight, and you pinch it good and solid, you know, between here and here. It's got to have a good solid pinch, and so, and that gives that all the support that the crankshaft needs to, you know, that belt is turning the camshafts, which is difficult to do no matter which way you cut it, even. And so if the ballets are hitting tightly, properly tightened, the rotational torque of the crankshaft as it's pulling that timing belt or the timing chain will actually shear this key, and the crankshaft will get ahead of the camshaft. I saw this on a Bronco one time where they came in with low engine vacuum running rich, and by the time we got to the bottom of that situation, somebody had pulled the balancer off and put it back on for some reason in their yard, and they just tightened it up with a ratchet, and they stopped when they felt like it was, the belt was lined up right. They didn't torque it like it was supposed to be, and so the key had to carry the entire load of that was on that gear pulling the camshaft, and it sheared the key, and they got the engine just enough out of time to where it had late valve time and low vacuum, and the map sensor was picking that up, thought it was loaded, puffing out black smoke. It was a seriously aggravating mess. I have seen some people leave the balancer, the pulley, crankshaft pulley slash balancer loose on an Escort. It's got that tone ring for the crank sensor, and that thing, whenever because they didn't tighten it up enough, it'll waller out that keyway, and that thing will move, and you'll have, the timing will actually change because the tone ring is in a different place sometimes when you start it up. And I've seen them where it would run lousy one time, the next time you take off it'd run good, and run lousy and run good, and you get under there and look, and somebody didn't tighten the bolt, and it's wallered out that, you know, that keyway in the this keyway here in the crank, you know, the crank sensor. Well, the game set, but the match wasn't over. The next day he starts the probe, drives away from the shop. He didn't go 300 feet before the engine died. So we had stumbled onto a circumstantial landmine. We didn't do anything to cause this that we knew of, right? So, question 6. When a failure occurs right after you performed a repair, you should get mad and quit your job, tell the customer it wasn't your fault before you look at it, find out what happened, and be honest if it's something you missed, or lie about the whole thing. No, you're just supposed to find out what happened and be honest if it's something you missed. If it's something you didn't miss, you know, then you tell them, hey, this is something that just happened. And everybody has seen that. You know, the old story I told you about my dad putting brake pads on my sister's Chevrolet. It was like an old 77 Caprice. And after he put the brake pads on, the radio wouldn't work. When she changed the fuse, it blew the fuse immediately, and she blamed him because it was working when it went into the shop and it wasn't working when it came out of the shop, which was ridiculous. So, but anyway, it had a shorted capacitor in the radio. I found out what was wrong with it, but it had nothing to do with him putting those brake pads on there. So anyway, I can tell a lot of stories about that kind of, you know, coincidental stuff. There's other stuff that seems to be coincidental failure, but was actually caused by something we did. Like one time on an older S10 Blazer, we had the transmission out, put it back in. The guy comes back and said his rear hatch wouldn't work. Well, you know that gummy stuff that's in those neutral safety switch connectors? When the guy plugged it back in, he didn't plug it back in all the way, and the ground to the rear latch on the hatch goes through the neutral safety switch, so you won't open the hatch while you're driving down the road. Since he didn't plug it back in all the way, there was no ground to the actuator on that latch. See, it didn't look like anything we could have caused, but it turned out that it was. And so you got to be honest with yourself and just look and say, oh, let's just see what it is, you know. Well, this 2.5 liter was spinning, but it was backfiring through the intake, and it was puffing smoke through a narrow crack in this inlet tube that we hadn't seen before. So it's going to have an inlet tube. And we did miss that, but that wasn't what was causing the problem. So we did some backtracking, checked the fuel pressure, 40 pounds plus, checked the fuel quality and spark. They were fine. Why was it firing like it had crossed plug wires? We hadn't done anything to cause that. Well, I had a student pull the right front wheel on the splash shield again to see if we disturbed the crank sensor so that it had been damaged by the belt or pulley. Sometimes when somebody misroutes the crank position sensor, it'll wind up getting, you know, chafing against a pulley, or the wires will get cut by a belt. Looked at that. That wasn't what happened this time. Induction backfire is typically caused by what? Cross plug wires, cam timing issues, lean misfires. Any of the above can cause that. All right, with the timing covers removed, all the marks lined up perfectly. Everything was just like it was supposed to be. Nothing had changed. And we pulled the entire covers off of it on this one and just looked to see what was going on. Okay, so all the timing marks were lined up. The problem had to be somewhere, but what about the distributor? What's going on there? So since it was firing out of time, we decided we were going to line everything up and see where the distributor rotor was pointing. Number 8, if you don't have a cylinder hone and you do a lot of engine work, you should A, find somebody to loan you one, B, use sandpaper, C, don't worry about honing the cylinders, D, buy a good hone, or E, grab your brother by the beard and jerk him around. That's a reference to a story where this whip-figured skinny hillbilly of a mechanic was over there and he had a big old beard on his face, rooting around in his friend of mine's toolbox. I said, what are you doing in his toolbox? He said, I'm looking for his cylinder hone. And I said, well, you're an engine mechanic. How come you ain't got a cylinder hone? He said, my brother borrowed my cylinder hone and he didn't give it back. And I said, well, why don't you get your brother by the beard and jerk him around? And he goes, how'd you know my brother had a beard? I couldn't imagine his brother not having a beard, to tell you the truth. He looked like Snuffy Smith. All right, where is it pointing? With the cap off in the position of the number 1 firing post noted and marked on the distributor, we found the rotor was pointing at number 6 instead of number 1. That was our smoking gun. But how and why did this happen? With the rotor pointing at 6 and this one turns counterclockwise, the distributor does, when it's seen from that angle, because it's on the back of the camshaft on the forward end. What might have caused this issue? The gear marks were lined up, but the camshafts were out of line. There's only one thing I can think of that would cause the distributor to be pointing somewhere else besides where it was supposed to. It was because the camshaft was pointing somewhere it wasn't supposed to. The cam gear bolt was just loose enough that the gear had spun ahead and left its shaft and the distributor behind, like I was talking about earlier with that keyway. And except in this case, there's a little knock pin there. But this is not a picture of that particular bolt on that particular car. I just had this picture so that you could see where that knock pin was. See, and this is on the same kind of engine, but just for clarity, so you could see it. I basically found one with the bolt backed off a little bit so you could see that. All right, so on a timing belt equipped inline 4-cylinder engine with a 1432 firing order, you can find number 4 TDC by lining up the timing marks. That's true. If you line up the timing marks, number 1's on top dead center compression, so number 4's on top dead center exhaust. You can find a TDC compression on number 2, that's not right. Finding valve overlap on number 1 puts you at exhaust stroke top dead center on number 1, which would mean 4 would be on compression. None of the above. All right, whatever. All right, the gear shaft relationship on this 2.5, it matches the position of the cam gear exactly where it's supposed to be. That's what this little knock pin does. Again, the knock pin is not supposed to carry any kind of a load. It's actually because you got that bolt, you got that built-on washer's got to tighten up real tight against there. Okay, this pin on this engine was missing, and whoever had replaced the timing belt had lined up the slot with where the pin was supposed to be and tightened the crap out of the bolt to keep the gear in its shaft aligned. And there's your little picture of the little knock pin there. All right, the little four-banging brother of this V6 uses the bolts. If you've worked on one of those, you know this. It uses the bolts in their washers to keep the camshaft and gears married. So does the 4-liter Explorer, if it's an overhead cam one. There's no knock pin, there's no keyway, there's no anything on those. But before tightening, you got to make sure the camshafts and the timing marks are all right where they're supposed to be. And then you tighten it all up. And I think, well, if that'll work on one of those, it'll work on this one. All right, so we found the sweet spot on the cam boss. I think what happened was when we used our impact wrench to spin that bolt off, to pull the balancer off, and then we spun it back on, we must have bounced the timing gear belt and loosened that thing a little bit, or maybe indexed it a little different or something. That's the only thing I could come up with that would have caused that, because of us changing that balancer. It was a landmine though, and it was a bomb that was made to blow up there. So I use an old Jeep 4-liter rotor alignment trick, right, to fix that, and I'll show you that in a minute. Best kind of job is one where you earn your money with your smarts and skills, not any of this other junk. But a lot of people like to sit there and play on their cell phone when they're supposed to be working. Now you find the cam and crank timing marks in place with the distributor installed. I use a Sharpie to mark what they were originally made on the distributor housing, the reference number 1 firing post. And we set the camshaft so the distributor rotor was just passing the number one firing post when we locked it all down. And the reason you do that is because whenever the timing is advanced, this rotor is farther back this way when that spark jumps off of it. So if you put it so it's just passing, you're centering this window right where it will always fire to this post. Now if that thing was pointing right at the post and the timing is advanced to like 55 or 60 degrees whenever you're cruising down the highway and you don't have any load, you're going to find out that this rotor is going to be back here and that spark may jump to the post behind it. And that's a problem that's always been with these. Whenever you had one that had you were just setting rotor alignment when you turned the distributor, that needed to be fixed. And there were some Jeeps that we had that was bucking and jumping going down the road because it was jumping sometimes to the post behind it whenever the timing was really advanced. So we would have to adjust it so that this rotor was just passing that firing post, that number one firing post. And that's why I cut this cap out, so I could actually inspect that while I was adjusting the distributor and get it right where it's supposed to be. Well, that trick worked. We torqued the camshaft bolt to 100 foot-pounds, slid the valve cover back on, and the engine ran smooth and quiet. It was one of those moments when I heard it fire up and purr, just like it needed to do. Well, I'll see you guys next week. Hope everything goes well. And hey, let's all be careful out there.